Hi, folks. This is Ani King again with allcounselors.com with another segment of our inclusive therapy series. We are doing an excellent webinar today with Lisa Lackey, who's going to talk about specifically burnout for women, how that's been impacted by COVID-19, how that specifically affects Black women and as it relates to the strong Black woman myth. And we're going to have a lot of really interesting conversation today about those areas. So we'll give it just a minute while we let folks come in and get situated. Just so folks are aware, if you have any questions you want to ask, the best way to do that is to hit the chat button or the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. And I will collect your questions so that we can ask Lisa at the end. For folks who are just coming in, again, go ahead and get situated. Lisa has a lot of experience. She's an LCPC, she has a CSAT, CMAT, and has been running. How long have you been running Inside Out at this point?
You know, I always get confused. It's been over 20 years. Yeah.
Which is fantastic.
It is.
Lisa, and it's such a good mission. Would you mind telling me and the audience a little bit about yourself and Inside Out Living and kind of how that led you to want to talk about topics like these?
Yes. So, Inside Out Living is, I would say, birthed out of mine and my husband's experience in terms of our recovery journeys. And really realizing that you could make a lot of behavioral changes and you can look good even and not have that matching on the inside. And so the work that really meant something to us in our personal lives was when we were able to be more vulnerable and transparent and meet those shadow parts of ourselves that we try to avoid and make connections. And so when we built this business, even before it came into fruition, the name was going to be Inside Out Living. And I think we're a healing trauma and addiction center. And when we're working with people in addiction, mostly we're working with a process addiction, sex addiction. And underlying any addiction I've ever seen in the years that I've been in this field and in my own life, there's trauma. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes trauma does not get addressed. We want to kind of take care of the behavioral things, and you do have to do that because they're causing the disturbance. But if we don't dig down deeper, we find people replacing, and the digging down deeper is the look on the inside. What's happening internally, and where does this connect to your past, and how do we repair what wasn't repaired in the past? And so we have a staff, and we all work in the area of trauma, and they have other specialties as well. And we do individual group therapy, coaching, and intensives. And intensives are this opportunity to get 3 months of work done in a shorter span of time. Not that you're going to be done and you get your certificate of completion, but you start to clarify, it's not all these things I'm working on. It's a few things in a few areas. And we have offices downtown Chicago and also in a suburb just north of Chicago, Evanston, Illinois, where Northwestern University is. And then, like everybody else, we're doing a lot of virtual stuff as well now. So we can meet people where they are.
That's terrific. And I think especially meeting people where they are and talking about women and emotional labor and how all of that tends to fall on their shoulders so much more than it sometimes does their counterparts. That being able to do, remote therapy or remote discussions or anything like that Um, I think I want to be careful not to say, hey, here are a lot of good things that have come out of the last year, because it's been a pretty devastating year for a
Oh,
lot of people.
there's been a lot of great things. I call it the
But
best of times and the worst of times.
Suddenly we're all able to kind of make these concessions for people who have probably already needed them, because we're able to see it, on a larger scale.
Absolutely.
So when when we started talking about this series, and started talking about, hey, it would be really important to mental health as it relates to women specifically. I'm curious what, I know my own reasons for thinking, oh, burnout's a really important thing to talk about, but what made that an important topic in terms of not just the people who are experiencing it, but the people who are going to be helping treat and work through those things?
So, one of the good things that came out of COVID for me is um, just realizing that I didn't have to go at the pace that I was moving at. I didn't even know that there was an option. And when I did, I quickly dismissed, oh, I can't do that because then this. And in my years of practicing, I would say primarily my work has been with men. And a lot of my coaching work and a lot of workshops and things like that and speaking engagements have been with all female audiences. And it doesn't matter, if I am in Illinois or California or Texas. There is this common theme among women of feeling like we never have enough time. And also feeling like that's okay, like that's part of our norm. And it's almost, becomes this topic of shame because we can feel inefficient if we're not just at a level of 10 out of a scale of 0 to 10 at all times. And I think, we bought into this so much. I don't know if you know Shaka Khan.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. And so I'm every woman, right?
Yeah.
And that was like something like maybe to aspire to. We can't be every woman. I think about when I was much younger, seeing this commercial that really kind of disturbed me. And it was, I won't get all the details right, but it was this woman where she could fry up the bacon and, bring home the bacon and serve the bacon, And I think she was like all dressed up and perfectly neat looking, right? And that became the standard. Growing up in a family that was pretty female dominant, lots of messaging, about this is the role of a woman. And most of the women, if not all of the women in my life at the time I was growing up, all worked outside of the home, but they also worked inside of the home. The work didn't stop. And the last thing I'll say about this is maybe about 5 or 6 years ago, I was at this festival, and there was this picture of this little girl, little black girl, and she's knitting and she's looking over kind of to the side. And the caption is, "A woman's work is never done."
Ooh.
Right?
That's profound.
Right? And so I think that, at least in this society, we're kind of groomed to that way of thinking and then feeling poorly if we're not measuring up, because you're never measuring up because that's an impossible standard.
Yeah.
And so when you put on top of that, I feel anxious or I feel depressed or I'm drinking a little too much or I'm eating a little too much or my mind is always racing and I can't slow it down. We turn that in and think there's something wrong with us. So we should just try harder.
Yeah. It makes me think there's a meme that I saw going around a while ago. And I can't remember all of the first part of the text, but it essentially was like, are you really good at stuff, or are you an emotional support daughter? And that kind of, like, the family expectations, that's, they start really early, and it's okay, you have to do this, and you also have to do this, and the expectation that you'll be nurturing and you'll be available and you'll be comforting and you'll be all of these different things. And then you get into the workplace and find that the expectations are really not any different than they were at home. It's still that you'll listen better, show up earlier, work harder, and that just continues to stack up over
until
time.
until you burn the heck out.
Yep. Until, yeah,
And,
it's just too much and you can't do anything anymore.
and then we still blame ourselves.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, that I remember one of my favorite aunts telling me when I got married, she said, "Don't start something you're not willing to do continuously." She said, because it's
Hmm.
harder to stop than it is to start. And I thought, oh, she's just saying that because, I was groomed to be successful at work,
Hmm.
successful as a wife, successful as a mom.
Hmm.
And I remember one time, this was like a turning point for me. It's probably been about 15 years ago, and I made this big collage. And on the collage, had all these pictures and words that were expectations of my family, of
Hmm.
me, my own family, my husband, my
Yeah.
children. And it's like, I'm not doing this anymore. I can't, like, this collage is a visual, and this collage is going to be ripped in pieces,
Hmm.
because if it's not, I'm going to die.
That's when I was in my early 30s, I had the first doctor ever who was like, listen, because I had some issues, just some general, issues, and my body started to hurt a little bit.
Hmm.
And she ended up saying, it seems really easy right now to just keep doing all of this, but there will be a point where you can't. And even if you don't stop, your body will stop you at some point. And that kind of tie back to, like, trauma will always show itself in some way, and you really can't outrun it. And whether it's at home or the workplace, or usually that combination of both, having that moment of, like, I can't keep doing this.
Hmm.
um, when you're working with women who are, experiencing burnout, you mentioned having a collage for yourself. Is that one of the things that you like to do with them, to, help them visualize just kind of the significance? Because I think that can be a hard thing. It's easy to minimize and say, okay, well, I just work too much, or I just do this too much, instead of saying, I've worked too much means that I have this many tasks and this many expectations and this many people who are compounding
Yes,
that.
yes, yes. And because I'm a trauma therapist, and I believe that um, you not just have to get your mind online, but you have to bring your body and your emotions and your soul. And so a lot of the work I do is experiential like that. Um, and so, yes, collaging is one thing. Another thing, when we were seeing each other more in person, I'd bring like a bunch of different hats and
Mhm.
ask people to grab those hats, and then over on another table would be, well, what do you need in that role that the hat is described? Grab that. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what are the expectations? And they're just like of different uh, word pictures. Grab that. And it's so interesting, because this always happens, is women, as many times as I've done this, they don't think about, in that moment, there's a whole nother group of women in there. Hey, can you
Mhm.
help me with this? It's like, let me adjust so I can take on more.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's important to understand kind of those first signs of stress. And you cannot recognize them if you're not in touch with your body.
Mm-hmm.
Because those first signs of stress are going to come in through, your sense self.
Mm-hmm.
Something that you're hearing, something that you're constantly seeing, something that, and that first sign of stress or any feeling is in your body. If we don't realize that, the brain makes a decision for us. And some of us will, escalate and be more in that fight, flight state, and I'm going to get it all done and more.
Mm-hmm.
And few, but there are some that will just collapse. And either one, we still tend to think something's wrong with asking for help. It's like an admission of defeat, whether it's because I have a mental health issue or because I'm in a time crunch or because, you know what, I just don't want to do it today.
Yeah. And I've heard other women also say that sometimes it's say, well, what am I going to do? Ask another woman for help who probably has just as much going on as I do. And that feeling of like, well, I can't bother somebody else with this.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of, I think it contributes to a lack of community, that idea of, if I ask for help, it's bothering someone. And so instead of, many of my hands make lighter work, it's everybody kind of holding as much as they possibly can with trying not to drop everything, even though it's spilling
Yes,
behind the whole time.
yes. And I don't know if this is true for you. It is true for me, and I have noticed it being true for a lot of other women. When I was growing up, um, my mom's side of the family, we all lived in the same community.
Mm-hmm.
And so if my mom couldn't pick me up from school, then my grandmother could, or my aunt, or an older cousin.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if my mom had to travel for her job, then I could stay with my grandparents or an aunt, or somebody could come to me. So there was that community of
Mm-hmm.
family. Um, and by the time I had my kids, we're not all in the same
Yeah.
community. And people are not only in the same community, like they're a plane ride away.
Yeah.
And so it's a whole nother thing learning how to depend on people um, that are not your family.
Yeah. That's sort of building your found family.
Yes,
That's That's been a huge thing. I moved around a lot as a kid, but when we did live in the same community as most of my mom's side of the family, dysfunctional as it might be, it did mean somebody could
absolutely.
always pick you up from school.
That's
There was always
right.
somewhere you could stay the night. If there was a funeral or a birthday party or a wedding, it was almost always the same handful of women who would
Hmm.
kind of come together and get everything done, but there was less of that feeling of just kind of being on your own. And I've definitely found, especially with more therapy and being around, found family more, that kind of being like, okay, I have to rely on you and you have to be able to rely on me. And there's sort of that little bit of give in a, okay, like we've chosen each other. So that means that if your kid's sick, cool, I'm gonna come get sick while you go to work.
Yes,
Or
yes,
if you need someone to watch your dog for a weekend, I'm just gonna take more allergy pills or whatever. And
yes.
it's that kind of like, but I think that when it's, that small found family community, and sometimes I think being a part of like the queer community, there's a little bit of ripple out where it enlarges a bit, right? But
Hmm.
it does mean kind of having to weigh that balance of like, okay, I know that, I'm dealing with all of this, but now my best friend is dealing with all of this. And how do, in those smaller groups, you still kind of provide that support and who leans on who. And I think a lot of times it ends up being like a three-legged stool where it's like, all right, just
Yes,
lean towards the middle and we'll get through it.
that's right. That's right. That's right. And I think that most of the time it is women that have to find those found families,
Hmm.
you know? Um, and thank God. Thank
Yeah,
God for that, because it's like, if I didn't have, I call it my family of choice. If I didn't have my
yeah.
family of choice, these women, all different ages,
Hmm.
I know that I could not get through so many things.
From the very small to the very large, from the my kid just got sick and I don't have any carpet cleaner and I don't have the
Yes,
car right now, to the I've lost someone very important in my life and I'm
yes,
not sure how to move through the world now. I think that, it's such an important thing to know that you can like have those people and also be there for those people at the same thing, that sense of
yes,
community care versus just self-care, finding a way to make those things wed together.
yes, yes. And that is, again, one of the things that women are most reluctant, well, men are too, most
Hmm.
reluctant to do work within a group.
Hmm.
And um, I really try to pitch, you know, the value of being in community,
Hmm.
because this allows women to rehearse things that they're not yet comfortable with doing in their real life. It
Hmm.
allows women to hear from other women, oh, you experience the same thing. And it allows us to speak up in places, in other places like we can't, or feel
Hmm.
that we can't. Um, and so it becomes a real um, positive impact on stress and burnout, because now I'm learning mutuality and interdependence. And
Hmm.
I keep getting to practice this and test it out and see, is this really real? And
Hmm.
it's facilitated by someone, so it's their job to keep this safe space. Um, and so many of those groups, women have stayed in touch. And what's so funny to me is like, you tight, in terms of sharing and vulnerability and transparency. And honestly, some of them don't even know each other's last name
Hmm.
or where they live, or, you know, but they're their soul sister. They're
Yeah,
their person that knows, that gets them, and they can say, right now, I'm not doing so good.
yeah,
Or right now, I'm doing great, and here's what I was able to do to get to this place.
yeah. It's almost like, yeah, it's an opportunity to release perfectionism a little bit, which
Hallelujah.
I think is one of those things that is one of like the greatest enemies of women, is this idea that there is any like standard of perfection for anything, because then you're just in this permanent state of striving for something that doesn't exist at your own expense, which always ripples out. And I think probably would take us a lot longer than now to talk about how that especially is impactful because of white supremacy and other things. But
Hmm.
I don't think that having a tight knit community kind of allows for that to keep existing if you want to stay a part of that community. Because sometimes it's just you have to show up with whatever your best, or honestly just your good enough for right now is, to make sure that you are a part of that community. And over time, it just gets less uncomfortable to say, hey,
Hmm.
I know I said that I would make dessert, but honestly, I just brought a box of cake rolls because that's what I had
Yes,
time for.
that's
And
right.
everybody else understands that you didn't have time to make pie for this potluck because they run into the same things too. And that sort of mutual validation of, okay, sometimes this is just how it is.
Yeah.
It's
And I
really
think
powerful.
as a clinician, when people come in, um, we know, generally speaking, that whatever they're bringing in is just the tip of the iceberg, right? And it's not that we don't have to attend to that, we do. Um,
Mhm,
but a lot of times, women might present with ailments
mhm,
or relationship problems or um, taking on so much at work or not getting in, you know, and underneath is so key what you said is like right on the other the same coin, just the other side of perfection is shame
mhm.
because perfection can never be achieved. And so for working with women, it's really gently moving kind of down that scale to see, you know, what are your beliefs about
Mm,
yourself? What are your beliefs about women? What are your shoulds? What are your shouldn'ts? Like, what, how did you get these rules? And what comes up when your body, when you're shoulding, you
mhm.
know? Because I think we don't always know because if you're constantly going or constantly stuck, you're not feeling.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That tip of the I it made me think, most of my background has been in tech and in managing people. And most of the time, if I've ever had to pull someone aside and say, "You seem really burnt out," it is, with very rare exception, been women. And it has been because there is this just constant feeling of pressure of, okay, I have to be the first one in and the last one out. And I have to be, everything I do, no typos, no mistakes, no anything. And a lot of my times, my question is has to be, okay, so who told you you had to do that?
Mhm.
Which is, you honestly, usually that ends up with people crying because the answer is nobody. But it's that kind of
Mhm.
like, okay. And that also acknowledging like that pressure does come from somewhere, and it's not always internal, and it's not it's I think there is a lot of that just kind of built up pressure around womanhood as a role and all of those expectations, and it's constantly reinforced by all of these little things. But I know the first time somebody asked me, okay, well, who said you had to do that, it was very
Mhm.
like cathartic and also
Mhm.
really derailing.
Yes.
Then you start to think about it. Okay, why do I
Yes.
have to be here first? Why do I have to be the one who sends every email out without a single piece of punctuation out of place? Or why do, and once you start asking that why, then it's like, well, now I don't want to.
Yes. Yes. But how do I not
Hmm.
only retrain myself, but those around me that I've trained
Yes.
to believe that you can depend on me all the time, 24/7.
Yeah.
And it's
Suddenly
that,
setting boundaries with people
yes,
when
yes.
for years, I think this has been especially true, like having children is that boundary of like, hey, I know I told you to always come to me about this, but actually I need you to go talk to dad.
Yes,
And it just like
yes,
consistently resetting, that's really hard to do.
yes, yes. Um, it's perfection pressure,
Yeah.
which, and it's not that men don't have that. They do. And the same things are not expected of men as they are of women. And, so let's even use people that are single and are without children.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
know, it's when I speak with friends that are in that situation, it's like, well, people always think, oh, well, you don't have anything to do.
Right. Which is not true.
Right. And guess what? Even if I don't, it's my business and my right.
Yeah.
Um, so there's that. And then there's just um, the physical implications of stress, and not attending to stress brings us over into burnout, which, if you've ever experienced burnout, it's horrible. And we're not thinking clearly. So again, we're blaming ourselves. You know.
I think I'm curious too, you know, I would love to think that COVID-19 is a singular, unique, long-going experience, but the truth is that we're probably only going to see more of these singular kind of, you know, difficult things that happen that impact a lot of people. What do you think that, you know, COVID-19 and I guess just large events in general that are really like displacing and all of these things, what is the, I think, just effect on women specifically? And I think too, kind of leading into the other part on Black women and other women of color, who may have even higher and different expectations kind of hitting them all the time.
So, like you said, that's like a question we could have chapters on, you know, and I'm not sure I know, you know, the answer.
Yeah,
but
there
what
are
I
probably
can
a lot of answers.
exactly. So first part you asked, say the first part again, the impact.
Just kind of in terms of the thing I'm getting to is I think that burnout, you know, studies are showing that it impacts Black women, women of color, more than it does their white counterparts. And I think that that has to have an impact, you know, in the therapy realm too, because that's an additional layer of expectations. That's an additional layer of pressure and those things. And I think my better formed question is, how do you approach that, you know, in a therapeutic sense, knowing that it's like it has that larger impact on daily life?
So first I'll share a bit of my experience as a client, not as
Yeah.
a therapist. And I've had therapists in my life, and great therapists that have helped me in so many ways, and other kinds of teachers. And the one that made the biggest impact, even before we said words, was a woman named Nancy Good. And Nancy was a Black woman. I'd never had a Black therapist. And I didn't know, you know, she was Black until we had our first appointment. And there was just a felt sense of there's understanding, and some things I don't have to explain. And I think it probably helped me that she was an older Black woman, because my experience again with grandmothers and aunts and play aunts, you know, that was always a good thing in my life. That was always a nurturing place. And so I could speak to her about experiences that I was having related to exploitation and racism, and being a Black mom and wife, and expectations that I might be putting on my kids because of that, and the pain that I feel that's so painful it's become numb and I don't notice it, and I'm feeling I don't have to bring her up to speed.
Yeah.
Another therapist I had, her name is Darlene Morgan. She was a white woman, and, you know, made a huge difference in my healing, like deep healing. And I think what made that comfortable is that she knew experiences that were not familiar to her.
Mm-hmm.
And she would name that. And
Yeah.
not only would she name it, then she would, between sessions go and try to understand more about this and come back and say, okay, this is what I'm learning. And so I was worth the time for you to spend time to understand something about me that was unfamiliar to you. And you didn't put it on me to teach you.
That's such a huge thing, the being seen and having somebody make the attempt to see you better instead of asking you to illuminate everything.
Yes.
That's really significant.
Yeah. And she would often say, I can't imagine. She said, you know how people say, I can't imagine? Like she said, I really can't imagine. And I don't even know if I'd ever be able to imagine. The closest thing I could get to it is something where the feeling was similar, but the experience is not. And so I think that, first of all, knowing all Black people, not just Black women, but every single day from, I would say, the time of being really little, we as Black people are self-protected automatically because we've had to be. And that's not a victim story. To me, that's really a brilliant, creative story. And it's also cost, because if you look at Black women historically, they were seen as people that gave everything. And I'm going to just be blunt, even their breast milk,
Yeah.
And so my body is not mine. My thoughts are not mine. My understanding and perception of myself and the world are not mine. And I have to survive.
Yeah.
And it's not that other women don't experience that. They do. But when you live in a country where at every crick and cranny there's structural racism, maybe you get to, when you're, with your own peeps. And so most clinicians, we don't have a lot of Black clinicians overall. There are more than there ever have been, but we're still not as many. And so the client already comes in the room. This doesn't mean not being liked. It doesn't mean, the person isn't good at what they do. Unconsciously, you come into the room a little buttoned up.
Shoulders up a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And maybe even not even disclosing some things that you would, not necessarily because you're trying to keep it secret, but because it's like, I want to really understand this.
And how much work will it be for you to have to help them understand it enough to use it as context?
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think, you hear a lot about, decolonizing the mental health space. And it's so needed. And for me, that means, using that overused term, thinking outside of the box, you know.
Yeah.
And does therapy always need to look like this? And let's look at our own personal biases, for real, and see how we might be imposing this even unconsciously. And
Yeah.
it's not just this kind of once and done thing. I take a course so that I can become trauma informed and racially informed, And
Mhm.
it's, what am I gonna do in my life, even if it's a tiny step, to expand my way of understanding and seeing the people in front of me that look different. Um,
Mhm.
Decolonizing means telling the truth that our whole mental health system is a racist structure. If you look
Mhm.
at the history, one of the very first diagnosis was drapetomania, and that was given to runaway slaves. Now, they were good slaves or had their right mind if they didn't do that.
Yeah.
And so, and nowadays, just seeing how many people, even still, and it's like, it's baffling to me how many times Black people have been given a diagnosis of schizophrenia.
Mhm.
And it's like, it's just, so these are extreme things. And the little things are just as much of an obstacle
Mhm.
to getting the care that you need from the inside out.
Absolutely. I mean, and again, all of the individual topics are lifelong conversations to be had, but even starting at a school age, how are behaviors handled in a classroom and how varied are they based on who the kids are, and that determines where they go next. And
Yeah.
everything, when you talk school to prison pipeline and how that impacts mental health and how just all of
Yes.
that, and the fact that the mental health industry is largely built on theories that are written by white colonizers means that there is something suspect kind of available at every turn, for anyone.
Yes.
It's it's
Yes.
such a maze to kind of get through. I read something recently talking about, it was a slightly older article, but talking about how Sigmund Freud both contributed to and did insurmountable damage to queer communities even today because of some of the things that
Yes.
he believed and pushed forward, and that just kind of the looking at, okay, what are the things that have done damage, and looking at, okay, and say 1985 we still believed this, and in 1995 we were a little bit better, but starting to look beyond that and say, okay, what will we think in 5 years didn't make sense, and how
Mm-hmm.
do we start working on that now?
Mm-hmm. And in my generation, how many Black girls were told
Mhm.
directly or indirectly, not only do you have to be the best, you've got to be better than that. You got to double down
Mhm.
because you are Black.
Mhm.
From school age,
Yeah.
you can't act out at school, because if you act out at school, you're going to get labeled.
Yeah.
Me even telling, the pressure of mothers and fathers, but we're talking about women, of some people refer to the talk as the talk about sex.
Mhm.
The talk is the talk about, here's how you handle yourself with racism. Here's how you handle yourself if once you start driving, you get pulled over.
Yeah.
here's what to expect when you think something is going on and it's a whole nother agenda. And is that true 100% of the time? No, but it's true 90% of the time historically. And so even our kids have to grow up so much faster. I'm looking down because I wanted to look at this is the way they're called telomeres. And so telomeres at the end of the chromosome, you may already know this. And what kind of tells what your real age is, not just your chronological age, is the length of these telomeres. Okay. So for Black women, no matter, how much it is true, Black doesn't crack. And so on the outside, you might look not your age. On the inside, Black women are 7 years older than white women of the same age because of stress and burnout.
That's huge.
That is freaking huge.
And it's hard not to think about all of the things that play into that start, like you were talking about, from school, from kind of having to constantly think about that perfection expectation that, okay, don't be too loud, don't do these things, don't do that, because here's what happens. And now you're in the workplace, and now you're in a relationship, and now you have to do this with your kids. Yes. And all of that stress and all of the things that stress does to your body just accumulating over time.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just
and we don't know it until we go to the doctor and your blood pressure is sky high, or you find yourself over and over medicating with food, or all kinds of things, right? And so it's not unique in the sense nobody else experiences this. It's unique in the sense no one experiences it to this extent. And that's fact. So it's not a theory, that's fact. And so radical self-care and self-love becomes absolutely needed among Black women.
Yeah.
Because every day you're getting older than you are chronologically if you continue not addressing the issues that face you. And then when you decide to address them in mental health spaces, then it's incumbent upon all of us to learn and understand more about how do I need to show up in this space for this person.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because
folks, just a note, we've got about 10 minutes left. So if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat or Q&A section. So sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, that's okay. So I think wherever I am, probably for the last 4 or 5 years, like my work is focused on women in general, and in particular ways, Black women and other women of color, because it's a different. And then with COVID, we see what was happening, and it wasn't just poor Black people that were having not just a higher level of COVID, but a higher level of death. And then any Black woman, mom or not, seeing all that was going on with the televised racism. It's not new, but you're looking at it. You can't help but see those people as your child or your brother or your husband or your sister or your mother. over and over, and you feel powerless because we're still trying to prove that this is a thing. Like, you're seeing it, this is a thing, and everybody's on board. But now it's a year later, and what did that on board really mean? What is the commitment?
I have a friend who does anti-racism courses with people, and she said before she started doing it, she was like, I swear if one more white person asks me how to be not racist, I'm going to charge them for it.
Yeah.
And one of her other friends was like, you should charge them for it.
That's
Send them
right.
your Venmo link. You're like, I'd be happy to answer you after I get my deposit. And so also that added layer of people now saying, once again, we would like you to tell us how to solve this problem, even though you've already told us how to solve this problem repeatedly. And we're going to be really excited about it for about 30 days.
Yeah.
And that's, yeah.
And people still want to, in some cases, censor you. Like, I was to work with this group, and the person that was the contact person reaching out to me, she was like, but I'm afraid that you might say too much. And say too much about what? You know, this is how I'm going to state facts, and I'm going to use research-based interventions to describe ways in which we can start to address things. And she never followed back up with me. And then maybe months later, I reached out to her for something completely different. And then I just said, hey, what happened there? And she said, well, I'm going to be honest. I didn't know if our people were ready for that.
Yeah, that's.
And we don't have to worry about it because we don't have Black clients. We have white clients, So,
wow.
And I honestly, in my heart, believe that most people are not doing things like that in an intentional way. I think there's so much education that people are afraid to have, and don't have.
Because then once you have it, you have to do something with it.
Yes, that's it. That's true.
And change is really scary, especially I think when you're talking about a system that is by design always kind of got everyone on edge to some extent. And so as long as you feel like you're here and somebody else is here, then there's that worry that, okay, well, what if I give up some of my privilege, or what if I give up some of this? Well, then I'm not here anymore. Now I'm just here. Instead of understanding, then here starts to not exist anymore, or here exists, but other people start to be there as well. But it's a lot of fear, I think, kind of all of the time. And I think, living in COVID times, that amplification of a lot of very specific fears, and it gets so hard, I think, for people to kind of separate between, okay, like this is a legitimate fear and here's what I can do about it, or this is a thing that has been amplified, because it all kind of gets thrown together in noise. And I think, when we're talking kind of specifically about women, if you're already doing more than the next person at your job, or you're already trying to shoulder a lot on your own, or you're dealing with a mental health crisis but feel like you can't, or honestly can't get the help, in some cases, because mental health is not always accessible to everyone, depending on where they live and what their situation is. Then it just gets even harder, and then that burnout becomes not that kind of multi-layer of like, okay, this is work and this is home and this is the world. And where do you even start with that? We've got just a few minutes left, and I know I've asked you a lot of questions. Is there anything you want to make sure that we talk about as we close out that we didn't get to yet?
I don't think it's anything we didn't get to. What I think I would like to say is that, kind of in summary, life is stressful. Women metabolize stress differently than men do. And so working with women in general, we need to assess for that in creative ways. And we need to, you know, unnormalize, I know that's not a word, this notion that we should be every woman, and reach for the shame that's underneath those layers of perfection to bring healing. And if we can do that by bringing women together in community, we can make big impacts. And just basic educating women on, this is what stress looks like, feels like, does to your body. And this is what happens if you don't address it. These are the symptoms of burnout. And here's what happens mentally, physically, spiritually if you don't address it. And if you happen to be a woman of color, you've been living in stress your entire life without even knowing it. And wow. And how can we change some of that?
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lisa. Folks, real quick, just so you know, and I will drop it in the chat as well, you can learn more about Lisa and Inside Out Living by going to www.insideoutliving.com.
It's InsideOutRecovery.com.
Or InsideOutRecovery.com.
Yes.
This is why we'll have put it in the chat. So sorry about that.
That's okay.
And again, this has been such an incredible conversation. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today and answer these questions. We will have a replay up as well for anyone who wants to dig into this again. And you can find all of that at allcounselors.com.